Micah White is a protester by nature. Known as one of the brains behind the Occupy Wall Street movement, White has actually been standing up to authority since early childhood and usually prevailing. There was his refusal to stand for the Pledge of Allegiance in school and his protest of religion at school during an atheism phase. There doesn't seem to be a situation that White won't question. So perhaps it should come as no surprise that White is willing to challenge current thinking about protests themselves. His new book is called The End of Protest, a new playbook for revolution. We spoke recently and I asked him why he thinks protest is dead.
Protest is broken because activists have been following a kind of storyline about how social change happens, and once we achieve that storyline with Occupy Wall Street, we realize that it's no longer true. So I say protest is broken because the storyline that's been dominating contemporary activism is basically if you can get lots of people into the streets, rallying around a unified message, largely nonviolent, then our elected representatives will be forced to listen to us. But that's not true. In fact, we've seen with Occupy Wall Street, a movement that spread to 82 countries, 1,000 encampments, that in fact, when you achieve that very difficult thing, getting that many people into the streets, doing a synchronized behavior, it doesn't mean that our elected representatives somehow have to magically listen to us. It's not in the Constitution. And so protest as we know it right now is broken, and the challenge is for activists to figure out new strategies of protest that can kind of fix it.
You call the failure of Occupy a constructive failure. But let's start with why was it a failure? In what way did it fail?
You know, when we started Occupy Wall Street, we had a pretty clear goal, which was, if you read the original tactical briefing that inspired the movement, the idea was, let's create a movement that can get money out of politics. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to somehow create a movement that's going to overturn Citizens United, the famous Supreme Court decision which has given corporations and unions the ability to spend unlimited amounts of money influencing our elections. So the goal was very clear. The goal was to end the power of money over our elections. That did not happen. And so I called it a constructive failure rather than a total failure. It wasn't a total failure. It had lots of positive symptoms, and more people are now interested in activism. It's changed the dialogue. People are using the language of Occupy, income inequality, and stuff like that. Those are positive things, but that wasn't the goal. Those are symptoms. And so it was a constructive failure.
When Occupy was going on, there was a perception that there wasn't really one thing, that it was a kind of a disjointed request for a bunch of different things. Right. Was that part of kind of the breakdown? Would it have been better if it had been a very clear, this is the one thing, and that everybody involved was clear on that point?
It's a difficult question. It's a really good question to ask and to consider. I mean, it's difficult to answer because on the one hand, there is a storyline that, Occupy failed because we didn't have a single, clearly articulated, unified demand. I would say our demand was pretty clear. But I don't think that's true. I don't think that's the reason why we failed. In fact, if you look at, for example, the 2003 anti-war march, where people all around the world on the very same day in every single country, millions and millions of people, they did have a unified message. They said no to war on February 15, 2003, no to war. It didn't stop the war. George Bush ignored it. Tony Blair ignored it. So the key thing to realize is that we are chasing an illusion. It's not as if only we'd had a more unified demand, then it would have worked. No. The demand was unified, and even if it had been more unified, it still wouldn't have worked. The core concept here is that mass mobilizations in the streets do not achieve the goals that people are trying to achieve.
You're quite dismissive, actually, in the book of sort of these big nonprofits. You sort of suggest that these big protest marches, even when they're synchronized globally, are a waste of time because they don't actually affect political change. But to me, you kind of gloss over the fact that they might actually be consciousness raising, that ordinary people might actually change their views because of those marches. Why aren't they effective for that reason alone?
Right. I mean, we have something in America and around the world that I call something like a protest industrial complex. We have organizations whose goal is to create protests. And one of the reasons that they justify their existence is by saying, well, the best we can possibly hope for is that we're at least spreading a message, we're raising awareness around an issue. But the fact is, when we created Occupy Wall Street, we didn't set out to raise awareness around income inequality. That was a byproduct of the fact that we created something that spread globally. And the thing for activists to understand is that if you create something that spreads globally, the byproduct will always be that you're raising awareness. That's not the end goal at all. And it has to do with this question of what is our objective? Is revolution possible? Is it desirable? And I think a lot of people have kind of given up on the hope of revolution. And now they think, well, the best we can possibly do is to get the people in power to parrot our language. So what I'm really doing isn't so much social activism as social marketing. I'm marketing ideas and spreading them around, and that's fine, but it's not activism.
Why are the people in power not responding in the same way to, in a democracy, in other countries there will be other reasons, but in your country, It's a democracy. Why not? Why isn't there a greater response by people in positions of power, especially politicians who are answerable to those people, when there is a protest? Why is it not working?
Well, I think because they don't have to. I think that protest has become part of the script of the political process. You know, there's no reason, there's no law that says you have to listen. There's no law that says, oh, I'm sorry, like if you're a president and X number of people protest in your country, like you're immediately out of office or anything like that. These actions, they've come to understand, are symbolic, and if you can just wait through them. The thing about social movements is that a social movement can't last very long. It's just the nature of the phenomenon that if you can go, I talk about, I think about 28 days, or with Occupy, it lasted about almost 60 days. If you can last 60 days as a presidential, then you're done. And that's why Obama, he never talked about Occupy until the movement was over, because he knows what you do is you just wait. You just wait. That's the core thing, and so they just wait it out. And so protesters need to realize that the only way to achieve our objectives is to start winning elections in multiple countries and carrying out a unified political agenda. And that requires a kind of complexity that we're only starting to see in Europe, and that really is lacking in America and even Canada to a degree.
So as the protest or the form of protest evolves, what's the next step? You know, what's the sort of the path that you would say to activists? Because you're not saying forget it, nothing's going to work. You're saying stay activists, but here's the roadmap.
Yeah, I mean, I've been an activist my entire life. I started doing activism at 17. Obviously, I'm not saying don't protest. I'm saying never protest the same way twice. I'm saying protest differently, innovate protest. So what does it look like? You know, if we go back to Occupy Wall Street, what we really did, the way we created Occupy Wall Street is that a social movement is created from a contagious mood and a new tactic. So with Occupy Wall Street, we spread a contagious mood that we got from the Arab Spring, and we combined it with the new tactics that were coming out of Egypt and Spain. So right now we see also new tactics emerging in Europe, and that new tactic is social movements that win elections. We're seeing it in Spain with Podemos, in Italy with the Five Star Movement. They're now starting a multi-country one called Diem. This is the future of activism. The future of activism is social movements that are able to do complex behaviors like win elections, elect representatives from themselves, decide on what the legislation is going to be, govern the cities once they get into power. Instead of putting our hopes into isolated individuals, it's instead this amazing kind of horizontal concept of, no, we're a social movement, we're a protest movement, we're going to use street protests to get into power, to win elections, to swing elections. This is the future of activism.
The problem, of course, is that some of these protests have a kind of a leaderless feel to them. What you're describing is actually replacing the state, not causing the state to collapse. Is that right?
Right. I mean, I think what I'm describing is how would you, I mean, it's a question mark. How do you do this? So the challenge that we're trying to face is how do you have something that's basically a social, horizontal, largely leaderless movement that can at the same time carry out tasks that's typically associated with leaders. Typically only a leader can become president, and only a leader only leaders can vote in Senate and Congress and this kind of stuff. So the idea is, well, how do we somehow leverage the internet or complex decision making among groups to kind of like get to this next level?
The notion of campaign finance reform as a pillar of improving democracy in the States seems obvious, and it's seemed so obvious for so long that it's amazing that more people in positions of power don't take it up. Some have, but not enough. I live in a country that does have campaign finance reform, that the power of unions and third parties and corporations has no more than any individual when it comes to election financing. But we still have income inequality and diversity issues and all of the things that we would say might be a result of that. So are we sure that those of us who think it's a silver bullet, maybe it's not? Right.
That is a really important question. This way that social movements work, like I said, is that they combine a contagious mood with a new tactic. I actually think that the specific issue that they're rallying around isn't core to what a social movement is about. These social movements are about the people rising up and gaining sovereignty over themselves, living the lives that they want to live versus the lives they feel like they have to live, losing their fear. You know, it's about these emotions of personal liberation, collective liberation. And so the people will orient around specific policy issues, and those policy issues will change throughout time, but they're not essential to the nature of the movement.
He was co-creator of Occupy Wall Street, but Micah White has been stirring up trouble for as long as he can remember, almost as though he's missing a quality most people have in spades of a bias towards the status quo. What was that in you? Why were you born an activist?
Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time because it's kind of this strange, you know, what's been my fascination with activism. I think on the one hand, you know, it's my biographical background, my race. My dad is black and my mom is white. And at the time when they kind of got together, in many states in America, it was illegal. It was illegal to have interracial marriage. So I think in a certain sense, I'm the product of like an activist marriage, an activist love. But on the other hand, it's kind of like asking a painter, like, well, why are you a painter? And it's like, I don't know. It's essential to who I am. And I started doing activist campaigns every year throughout my life, and then some of them just like would take off. When I was 17, I had a huge success. I was on national television, all this kind of stuff, and I started to realize like, wow, I'm really good at this thing, And then I held on, and at 28 comes Occupy Wall Street, and I'm 34 now, but I think at 40 something else will happen, and 50 and 60 until eventually, it's like. You
used to read Adbusters as a teenager, and then wound up working there, and in fact partnering on Occupy. And how amazing was that for you to actually wind up working at that magazine?
That was my dream job. It was exactly the thing I wanted to do, and that it was my dream job, and I was able to get to a place where I was in this kind of magical collaboration with Culla Lassen, who's the founder of Adbusters. And that's why Occupy happened, is because we were in this, the months before Occupy Wall Street, we were basically just in this zone together where we would talk on the phone every day. We were watching what was going on around the world. We would just brainstorm ideas. He has a really good revolutionary instinct, and I'm a lifelong activist, American, he's Canadian. And so we just kind of like talked it out, came up with the idea, and we both knew this is it. This is an awesome idea. We ran with it, and it just took off,
You say yourself, you're an activist, and you've had various forms over the years, starting at whatever it was, 13. If you're an activist in search of a cause, is there something opportunistic about that? In other words, can we feel maybe it's not as genuine as if there was the one thing that you devoted your life to?
No, I think it's what being an activist is that you pay attention to your intuition and you fight for the injustices that strike you most strongly. I think that in my life, what I've always done is I've always fought for the things that I felt like were the true injustices in that moment. And you're right, like the campaigns that I did when I was 14, 15, 16, now I look back and I don't agree with the specific issue that I was rallying around. But instead, again, it comes back to this question of this is about collective liberation, personal liberation. It's about being our true and authentic selves. And that can take many different expressions. So I think that this kind of political consistency is overrated, that instead, like in protests, we need to constantly be innovating. So for activists who are looking for a cause, instead I say, like, look at your life, look at the things that just irk you, the stuff that you just like feel intuitively about, and then you fight around that. And that seems to be what unlocks effective campaigns. Your
unified theory of protest has 4 pillars,
right.
And one of them is sort of the divine, sort of the road to Damascus kind of style of intervention, which brings you a long way from one of your early activisms of forming an atheist club at your high school.
Right.
Why is that an important element? It's actually something that, it's a bit of activism on your part, because most of the theories of revolution have rejected that particular element, and you're saying, no, it's going in. Why is that important?
Right, you're right. Yeah, no, it is a kind of activism that I'm waging against the theories of activism. So, I mean, it's basically what the dominant concept of activism right now is, that human actions create change, and that's called voluntarism. But there's other theories. There's theories that says that actually larger economic factors are what create change, is structuralism, or that we have to change our minds in order to change reality, and that's subjectivism. But then I think there's a fourth option, and that is that revolution is a divine intervention into our lives, into the political sphere. And when you start to think in those terms, it opens up strange and interesting new ways of being an activist, And I think that for most Western activists who've been raised on the kind of Marxist, secular, materialist background, they reject that. But, if you look back at Occupy Wall Street, there were certain acts of God, if you will, that seemed to kind of inspire our movement. For example, a major hurricane came in right around the time we were organizing, and it actually interrupted one of the organizational sessions that we were having. It set this weird mood, There was like a mini stock market crash. There was other weird stuff that inspired people. I'm sure certain people had dreams about the movement that inspired them to come down to Wall Street. There's all this kind of stuff that's unexplainable that kind of, I think, plays into movements. And so, of course, the best example is Christianity. Christianity conquered because St. Paul and then Constantine had visions of Christ. I mean, so you're having a social movement that succeeded because someone had a dream. Oh, that's divine intervention.
Is it safe to say you're no longer an atheist?
Yeah, no longer an atheist. For me, it's more about a more nuanced. I think materialism, it only allows you to see half of what causes social change.
So what is the future? You've actually outlined sort of the future of protest, the next stage, in 3 key ways. Describe them for us.
Right. So I think if we're going to kind of, the thing about revolution is it always happens when we least expect it, and it always kind of happens differently. So if we keep thinking, the next revolution is going to be like Occupy Wall Street, it's not. And people who are looking for that are completely wrong. So if I kind of like check in with myself and I look at, well, what's my revolutionary intuition say about the future? I think there's 3 revolutionary scenarios that we should look for. The first is the idea that rural areas, I live in rural Oregon, a town of 280 people called Nehalem, that rural areas are an opportunity for activists to kind of gain political sovereignty, that these areas are actually, that it wouldn't be that hard for activists to take over city council, to become the mayor of these places. And then once you have the sovereignty that we so craved during Occupy Wall Street. We set up these assemblies during Occupy Wall Street thinking we'd have sovereignty, but instead, actually winning an election in a tiny town where there's only 280 people gives you a kind of federal recognition. And if you are able to be an activist city council that's able to use that as a platform for campaigns, well, then we might see some magic happening here. So that's the first revolutionary scenario, is that rural areas represent a potential. The second is that we're going to see the birth of a kind of women-led social movement. I think women are going to be the foundation of a massive global social movement eruption. And that could take the form of like a world party that's able to win elections in multiple countries around the world. And then the third option is a kind of that we could develop autonomous kind of protest bots or chat bots that work on Twitter and Facebook to talk to people, to convert them to the cause. This sounds far-fetched, but we've already seen that ISIS is kind of already doing this. They're using Twitter bots to spread their message of hate. So I think we could have the same thing where we're spreading messages of peace and social movements through these bots.
Activists like Micah White are very focused on the social inequities evidenced in North America and believe that the popularity of polarizing politicians like Donald Trump is more evidence of a loss of hope.
I think that people across the political spectrum understand that social change is being denied to them, and they're desperate for social change. We need social change in America. People are poor, they're hungry. So we're desperate for social change at the same time that we are starting to understand that protest as we know it doesn't work. And so people are saying, well, at least we can just kind of like smash the system, And in a certain sense, that's a positive kind of mood. But ultimately, it's nihilistic, and it doesn't get you what you want. So I think all of Donald Trump, just as much as Bernie Sanders, is a symptom of the collapse of Occupy Wall Street. There's a famous saying, of course, from President Kennedy about if you make peaceful revolution impossible, you make violent revolution inevitable. And this is kind of the challenges that we're at right now, which is that peaceful revolution is being made impossible across the democracies just as much as in the Middle East. And that seems to be making a kind of civil war type situation.
You mentioned the Middle East, where we did see, the whole wonderful uprising, as you say, very kind of democratic. It has not turned out well for the people of Syria, of Libya, even Egypt, Tunisia. Things are not better than they were.
Right.
It turns out that dictators can sometimes keep order in a way that keeps people's lives at least stable. Does that undermine this sort of uprising, the spirit of we can do better than these people?
I think if we get sophisticated in thinking about, well, what happened in Egypt and these countries, then what we start to see is that the protesters, who were largely these kind of like, who got it started, were largely like secular youth. They made the fundamental mistake of refusing to be engaged in the political process. And this is something that we've kind of seen, is that these secular youth, what they'll do is they'll protest, and then they toppled Mubarak, and it was like, great, okay. And then the only force that was able to step forward and say, hey, I'll run for office, was the Muslim Brotherhood. And then the secular youth are used again to overthrow, to complete a counter-revolution against the Muslim Brotherhood. And what do they get? They get a government even worse than Mubarak, where there's more torture going on daily in Egypt right now than there was before. And so what it is, and to a lesser degree, we saw the same thing happen in Spain during their movement, where they also refused to engage the political process, and they got a right-wing government. But now in Spain, they have built a social movement that's winning elections, and so again, it just brings us back to this core idea, which is that you can't just protest, even if, when you topple the leader, if you're not willing to become the government or become a leaderless, governing situation, then you're just going to get something far worse than what you overthrew.
One of the most disheartening examples of somebody who rose to a position of power, promising change from within, promising to do things different, was Barack Obama. Great hopes, because he campaigned on a message of I can be an outsider. We're going to do things differently in Washington. It doesn't have to be that. He has the most powerful job in the world, and even he wasn't able to do it. So how optimistic are you about the idea of protesters moving into those positions and being able to change them, whether it's a CEO's job or the President of the United States?
Yeah, I mean, it is a real challenge. You know, one of the things that the great novelist Tolstoy says is that, you know, the people in the highest places of power are the least free, that their actions are more controlled than the people at the bottom. And so I think that we learned that with Obama. You know, you get someone in there, and then the structure itself keeps him from enacting the kind of social change that maybe he personally believed or we believed that he might do. And that, I think, it says why I personally don't believe in Bernie Sanders or Donald Trump, because they run on this kind of false idea that, no, I'm going to get in there and I'm going to be the one who can, like... And so it brings us back to this question of, well, what is the alternative? And I think the alternative is something where the people who are being elected are delegates, not representatives of the social movement, where they are people who are chosen because they're going to carry out the will of the social movement, which is greater than and less able to be corrupted than a single individual.
It sounds to me as though your current activism is about activism, the future of activism,
Right.
But what else is on your radar? What is the cause that you will fight for?
Yeah. Well, there's two. I mean, the one at the one hand is my local community in Nehalem, and just inspiring the people there to realize that they have like the amazing opportunity to create the best possible place on earth to live. We could easily take over city council and institute, Scandinavian-style welfare programs because of the timber that our city controls. There's amazing things that we can do. So the one is to inspire people locally to start taking over these rural communities. But then the second, is really this idea that women are going to be the next great social movement, and that we will see a social movement that arises out of women refusing to accept an injustice that they've tolerated for so long, and then they will spread a new contagious emotion with a new tactic, and that you'll see women all over the world rising up, just like we saw with Occupy Wall Street. It spread to 82 countries. We could easily see something like that, and just like Occupy Wall Street took everyone by surprise, same thing could happen with the women-led movement. We could wake up tomorrow and all of a sudden people are like, why are there thousands and thousands and thousands of women of all ages, from young to old, protesting in the streets? And so that's what I'm really inspired about right now.
Do you worry that the self-selected protester, the person that's able to go and sleep in a park, or is actually just too far outside the mainstream for the mainstream to embrace them? And as we saw with Occupy, then you get people that are even not really protesters, but who kind of come along and cause, again, friction in a way that sort of makes it easier to ignore if you're the establishment.
Well, this has to do with, how do you create a mass movement? And there's one idea, which would be to create a mass movement, you got to pitch mass ideas. And I think that actually what seems to happen is that if you want to create a mass movement, you pitch ideas from the edges of politics. And for some reason, that kind of captures people's imagination, and they rush to it. So for me, I think that it's actually better to kind of, what you do is you scour the edges of politics on the left or the right. You find those compelling and interesting, strange ideas, and then you kind of throw that into the mainstream like we did with Occupy. But you're right that there's a deeper question, too, about what is protest and who is the ideal protester. And one of the things that I'm trying to think about with my unified theory is that there's so many different ways to protest. Right now, the dominant concept is we have to be in the streets marching. But what if prayer is a form of protest? What if meditation is a form of protest? What if, monitoring food prices because you think that food prices indicate when revolutions are going to happen is a form of protest? So there's a wider and more complex, or what if just being your authentic self is a form of protest? It's a more complex and wider scope of actions.
All right, we've got to leave it there. We appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.